Thanks for having us. And look, we are going to touch on the Valley of Death, and it hasn't been talked about as much as I thought, but AI is probably more popular these days. And I guess, personally, I run one of the industry growth centres. We've funded a lot of businesses who've commercialised technology and seen many of the brick walls and obstacles for innovation in the local market. I've got two experts from two different very important sectors here, and so I'm going to launch in, but I actually like the way the topic was written up. So I'm just going to quickly read the sort of gist of the conversation here. We're really talking about, the Valley of Death or the Ditch of Despair, which I think sounds like a James version of the Valley of Death. And there's no doubt there's been a big increase on the focus of capital, and we just heard again about the challenges of raising capital. But and there's this question about insufficient funding to support crossing the chasm. And now, I guess, with the US and Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and this big injection of capital in the market, is that changing the playing field? Is that really made a big change? But I think before we look at the implications of those changes, we probably need to set ourselves in what the situation is today. So I might start with Sue, particularly given your expertise as the chair of Robotics Australia Group and your extensive sort of history in research and working with industry. What do you see as some of the big challenges in the Valley of Death?
I feel like a cliche because, it all comes back to access to capital, and whether people like to hear it or not, that is the number one issue facing the ability of our companies to start up and scale and grow. And I think we need to maybe be a bit more inventive about the ways that we consider how we are able to access capital. So with the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, are there some creative ways that we're able to access capital from overseas without us necessarily losing the links to that company? Because unfortunately, and I should mention, my sister's the managing director of Silicon Valley Robotics over in the US, and it is an organisation that was set up by early successful robotics companies to help to the younger generation of robotics companies to grow and scale. And she sees a stream of Australian robotics companies go straight over to the US. They don't even look to Australia for investment. And from my side, working in university robotics lab, I found it really frustrating to see that we were developing great talent and technologies, but we really weren't giving them very good reasons to stay here. And worse, when they go over and see my sister over in Silicon Valley, and they form a US company, we treat them like they're dead to us. Like there's no coming back. And somehow we need to fix that because, everyone who moves over to the US maintains their links in Australia, would probably be really receptive to the idea of having another office in Australia or having an R&D arm in Australia, but we don't make it easy for them. We just cut them off. And in fact, I've heard some founders who've moved back from the US say, yeah, it was like we didn't exist. People just wouldn't connect with us. So
I think that's the perfect segue to Ben, who might have some personal experience in that area. And Ben, maybe a bit of an introduction about your organisation as well.
Yeah, sure. So I come from a family of researchers, so I'm very sensitive to their needs in the ecosystem and have spent most of my life being a tech founder in health. So I've done 7 or 8 startups and spent 16 or 17 years in the US, went over with 2 suitcases like my parents did in the 70s and tried to figure out what it takes to commercialize in that environment. It's mostly been in health and now I'm exclusively in health. So any comments I make are with the bias of my own experience and from a health perspective. What's interesting to me coming back to the point that was just made by Adrian is we don't really seem to embrace as a culture the experiences and the networks of the hundreds of thousands of Aussies that have gone overseas, learned, failed, succeeded, whatever, but there's a huge asset base, especially in the modern world, in that network. And why it's so important to tech, and particularly health tech, is that any truly innovative opportunity in health has a global market. By and large, diabetes patients here are the same as in the US or in an African country. And so if you're trying to grow that idea and turn it into a company or a product and then a company and so on, you really have to, as Bronwyn said, focus on major markets. The Australian, health market is about 1% of the global market. And so to do that, what I've learned coming back is we have three things which tie into the valley of death problem. The first is, and it's probably because we've spent so much on research and we're so focused on translation, our early stage companies don't get enough support to understand what truly is best in class. So they're in a competitive environment. What they're developing, if it's trying to help a diabetic patient, is competing with a whole lot of other things that are going on. They're also collaborators all around the world. So is it technically best in class? Can it really work? Is it got a clinical chance? Is it going to be adopted by physicians all around the world? Is it in the white space or in the strategies for the next 15 years of the multinationals who are in that space? Because if it's not, it's going to be very difficult to commercialize because you need those sort of partnerships. And then lastly, is it in the thought processes and the strategies of the knowledgeable investors globally? Because you need 100 to 250 million plus. If it's a therapeutic, you need 30 to 50 million plus. You need 30 million to launch a digital health product in the US. You need capital. So what that is this concept of best in class. How do we make sure that we all understand what is best in class? And in health, that's probably different to robotics or space. The second one is back to this concept of connectivity. We are not well enough in health connected to the real decision makers in global markets. There are 75 multinationals. Their C-suite make a lot of the decisions. There are 250 odd institutional investors. Those people make a lot of the decisions of what gets backed or not. So to me, part of the issue is not that there isn't capital out there, and there's capital in Australia through the superannuation funds and so on and so forth. We've got the fourth biggest pool of capital, but no one tells them, go put 1/500th of what you've got into tech. Nobody. And that's a national disgrace from my point of view, right? It's our money, for goodness sakes. So that's one area. But what we really need to do is understand that we need to find every way possible we can, to, in health at least, to connect to the people who are the real players. If your son or daughter was a basketball player, you'd be trying to connect them to an NBA team if they were really good. It's just where the big market is. And there's all sorts of ways to do that. And we'll probably get onto other topics about what should government do, what should we do. But to me, coming back after being away 15 years, those are the things. Best in class, connectivity, and that leads to investment syndication, which is enough money.
I think it raises an interesting point because, I often, with our organisation, talk about the channel to market. Mm-hmm. And, commercialisation is not about making money from something, it's making it commercially accessible. Someone can make a business decision to acquire a capability to support their organisation in a way that you can survive and continue to develop and grow. And I think we struggle with our channels. I think Bronwyn mentioned 50% of the innovation in their sector doesn't come out of research, comes out of innovators. That's actually high in many, like a resources sector, 90% of innovation doesn't come out of research. Mm-hmm. It comes out of the mining companies innovating in the field with no vendor to translate capability. But I want to come back a little bit to connecting and sort of aggregating demand, because I think about Robotics Australia Group and the work you've done, Sue, and really founding that organisation, trying to bring the robotics companies together to share stories, battle scars, and probably in that, what's the opportunity to fail as well? Because if there's not a lot of capital, that means when you get it, you don't want to mess it up. So do we have a place that we can fail together and learn and grow? And is that what groups like Robotics Australia Group do for the ecosystem?
Well, that's something we would love to aspire to. I don't think, unfortunately, in Australian culture there is much room to fail, whether you're a robotics company or any sort of company. There's not a lot of tolerance for that. But I think, connecting the robotics companies within Australia together has been important because, unfortunately, when we started, and maybe a lot of these people, a lot of people in the room today don't actually appreciate that we have robotics companies in Australia. We build robots in Australia. I'd be surprised if we polled everyone in the room if they could name an Australian robotics company, but they do exist. And so we see that there's a great opportunity to be had if we can find ways to, as you say, help them learn from each other, and potentially just work more together so that they can actually find where they might have capability gaps that could be filled by other companies. I think the defence has been really quite trailblazing in the way that they have helped to incentivise this by a lot of the challenges that they've put out that have actually forced some of our local robotics companies to figure out, well, here's something that we can aspire to, but we don't have all of the capability. We need to actually match that with some other local capability to be able to meet this challenge. So that's all been very positive. And I think, though, at the end of the day, one of the issues that we have, and in some ways it is a blessing, because a lot of our companies are having to bootstrap, they can't even get capital, they have to bootstrap, they tend to have quite mature solutions when they have them. But then there are two issues. One is that Australia won't buy from them, because they think if it's developed in Australia it can't be any good. And so, ironically, we often have companies that solely export their technology, which seems like a real shame. And then the other issue that we have is that, yes, we might have more mature technologies. It's very unusual in robotics in Australia. I can't think of a single occasion where we've had vaporware. But, in the US, it's, people can just have an idea and get hundreds of millions of dollars, whereas in Australia, our companies waste weeks of their time applying for a $500,000 or less Commercialisation Australia grant that they then don't get, and find a US very well-funded company comes into the market with $50 million worth of backing, and they're like, well, what do we do now? Like they actually had the lead, they could have gone somewhere with it, but they just can't compete on the scale. And I just think and I'm not suggesting that I have the answers, but there's a problem there, there's an opportunity, and we need to find some ways that we can solve that.
And Ben, your thoughts on that? And I'd also be keen to get your thoughts on the role of government investment in that overall investment pool, because it is only one source of capital and it's not maybe the only source.
Well, if I could just pick up on that culture of not accepting failure, what's fascinating to me is that my goal when I identified these issues is to try to bring North American or very high quality European venture firms to actually come here and help. So when people wake up in the morning overseas and think about health, Bronwyn touched on some of these things, they think of us as having good basic research, which is true. They think of us as having a good, stable hospital system and some good clinicians, which is true. And they think of us as a great place to do clinical trials, but they don't think of us as a place to invest. And that's one of the things we have to change in perception. Now, so my goal and Lumira Ventures is a North American venture firm, a very high quality firm that I want to bring here because we don't have one. There isn't one single North American health focused venture firm active in Australia. And we need 10 of them, back to Bronwyn's point. As many good connected investors as we can possibly get, we need. So I think, I'm biased, but I think if government was doing this, and there's examples of this in Scandinavia, Canada, Israel, that's what I would focus on. How do you do things that require the connectivity and cut away the fluff to understanding what's best in class in any field, so we've got shots of getting a few wins? Then what we've seen in those ecosystems is once they get a couple of wins, people locally want to invest because no longer are we competing blindly with, I can't tell you how many family offices I've visited in this country who've made their money in property, mining, services, a couple in tech, and the answer is, I do not understand health investing.
Yep.
Right? Now, they could say tech across the board. They could say robotics, they could say space and these other things. But there's money there. We have to educate. Now, the best way that's done is we get a couple of consistent wins. And I know it sounds like I'm giving you the end answer, how do we get to the wins? It doesn't take many companies being supported to get the wins. And the cycle in health in Canada took about 5 or 6 years, from the very get-go of a process to consistent wins. And what that led to was much more foreign investment in cycle 2. The companies were allowed to stay. Now, admittedly, they're closer to the US border, but in cycle 1, 90% of companies were told you've got to come down and relocate south of the border. Now the number's less than 20%.
Yep.
So this evolution of the things we want policy-wise can happen, but what causes it to happen is people get comfortable that they should be investing in it, and that's what government can help to catalyse, I think.
It's interesting, I think, and we've got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to just ask for questions while I throw this one back to the panel. But listening to the minister this morning, is the problem up there, is the problem down here. I think the rest of the world shows that there's capability here because it invests in Australia. And ironically, most international firms actually come to Australia as a pilot ground to fail first, and once it works, take it back to the home market. So we're not afraid of, well, the rest of the world's not afraid of failing here, just we are.
Well, you see snippets of that in what they're doing in health. So in our clinical trials, it's $1 billion a year industry. There's more than 600 studies a year going on. Most of those are with small companies that are venture backed. And the way health works is you get some money to do the next thing. If it works, you get the next money to do the next. And the clinical trial, the early clinical trials, which is what our country is specializing in and doing a magnificent job, is basically a binary bet.
Yep.
So these companies from America and Europe are betting everything on how well we do a clinical study, yet we're not making them talk to the researchers in the area. We're not connecting our researchers to those companies. Those companies all have venture investors who in health are our peers. So across those 600 companies, I promise you, every single venture firm in the world has some connection to Australia already, but isn't taking the time to figure out what's tech's going on and should we invest down here.
And so if you've got some thoughts, I'm going to have to put a lid on the can of worms. And Lisby, I'm not sure if there's any questions, but go ahead, Sue.
I was going to say, is the messaging wrong, or are people just not prepared to listen? Because I think that, what we have seen, as Ben just described, is that there is an appreciation overseas of a lot of the work that we do here. But I think one advantage that Australia has is that because we haven't been on the front foot, we have a number of examples from overseas that we could just copy, right? We don't even have to invent it ourselves. We just go, that worked over in Canada, why don't we do that? But then when you try and have a discussion about that, it's just, oh, that's not relevant because. And there's always some reason why you can't take an idea from overseas and translate it into Australia. But at the end of the day, these are all excuses, and I'm not sure I understand why we keep coming up with excuses for not doing things instead of actually doing things. But that kind of feels like where we're at.
Yeah, we don't want to go down the Ukraine path of a unifying force in that nature, but maybe there needs to be more pressure on us as a country. Is there any questions from the audience? I know we're running tight on time. I think we've got one in the corner. Yep.
Yes, thanks. My name's Will. I'm actually Australian American, so it leads into the question. I found this really, I suppose it's for Ben, but maybe for anybody. I think having spent a long time working in both markets, in both countries, a lot of this resonates, but I want to kind of actually ask the flip of the question, because I think there's often a focus on how we need to follow on to example led by the US, whether it's the tech sector or whatever, and particularly when it comes to investment and getting things out the door. But I want to ask the flip of, when you talk to American investors, particularly have experience bringing some over and showing them around. I'm mostly in the agri-food area. They're astonished by the deep technical bench of talent in Australia and say things like, how do we not know about this? And so I think what I'm curious about is, what do you think the flip is in the advantages that we have in Australia that can reflect back that are things that the US is currently missing out on? And for me, one thing is I think hype cycles in the US get so noisy and messy that people's eyes just kind of glaze over. And there are actually interesting pockets of things where you can cut through. So, sorry, that's just one example, but I'm curious, yeah.
Sister, or you want me to go? Okay. So our advantages are that we're actually pretty cost and time efficient and punch above our weight, especially at that early stage of innovation, I think. Getting a prototype up, so on. I think our deep science and our institutional, by which I mean university backing, is actually helpful in many ways. I don't think we use it as well as we can, but that resource is extraordinary. And so simple things like one of my bugbears, if we found a way to better connect the sponsors of these trials who are working with clinicians and those clinicians to researchers in that area, that triangle would create so much more perspective, reference points, commercial reference points for our researchers and inventors that would help catapult us further. I think we're a long way away, but it's not that hard to communicate. I think we're trusted in so many ways as Australia as an ally of these major markets. All those things are in our favour. And I think we just need to keep telling the message. For me, what can we do as a community ourselves, among ourselves, is I think we need to support each other. I'm amazed at how much I'm going to say it, petty competition goes on. No, we just need to support each other. Any win is a good win. To your question of how many people know robotics companies, how many people know what Bronwyn's doing, how many people are standing up and applauding what Brandon's doing. They on one hand should be my competitor, but every time they have a win, I'm clapping, because any win helps us all and needs to tell the broader community that there are these wins or these milestones that are really special and important. I just look at the back page and see the sports people every day, and they're lauded. Why aren't you folks all lauded?
Including their failures.
Sorry?
Including their failures.
Yes, including
we still
their
love
failures.
them. Yeah.
And that was the thing on failures is we as a venture firm love CEOs who failed before, as long as she or he can articulate what was learned and why the
They got back
failure
up
occurred.
again.
They go further up the pile because it's experience. It's real experience.
Sue, any final thoughts? I think we're going to have to wrap up. There might be another question, but Sue, any
This
thoughts?
might seem a bit flippant, but to address where the capability gaps are in the US, you almost have to take all the money away, right? Because then you could actually increase the base, and we could be more mediocre if we had more access to capital, I suppose.
Well, on that note, I think, can you please join me in thanking the panellists, and we'll leave it there.